Welcome, everybody. So we will be focusing on access control today. In general, everything we're talking about today should be relevant, whether you're on the Community Edition or Enterprise Edition. I'm not talking about anything that is specific to Enterprise, I don't think. So hopefully this is relevant for everybody based on what I saw in the poll. Let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name's Nathan Fleugel. I've been working with the Rundeck team and product for just over 3 years. And typically I'm working with customers, dealing with their questions and helping them get started often, as well as obviously later in the process, helping them with what they need to know. So our agenda, pretty high level, some introduction to ACL policies and then some basics, a few recommendations, and then time for questions and demo as needed. So I wanted to start with a view of our architecture here. Everybody's familiar with Rundeck, so at least at some level, you've got some sense of this. But I wanted to talk about it so that we can see where ACL policy kind of fits in. First off, it's based on authentication. So however you are authenticating, whether that's local users in Active Directory, users in LDAP, maybe an SSO tool, depends on what you're doing. We're starting with that authentication, and based on the user who is authenticated and what groups they belong to, we're looking at authorization, which is really the ACL piece. So there's two sides to it, but it does start with that authentication and how you have authentication set up. We're typically getting the information about your users at authentication time from whatever your system is. We're finding out what groups they have membership for, and we can authorize them or deny them access based on the groups they belong to, or if you want to, based on their specific username. In some cases, it may be easier to just go with username, but most of the time we'll be dealing with a group, and that's what we'll look at today. From a resources and access perspective, you can think of resources as being broken down into two types. There are resources that are projects or components or resources within projects. That's what's on the left side here. There are sub-resources that are system resources. So the system resources, key storage historically is a system resource, and the users and groups themselves are that information is kind of stored outside of projects, although it's applied in the context of projects. But because users could be in multiple projects, it kind of lives outside of the project itself. Within the project, the main objects that you might think about that are resources you would be allowing or disallowing access to are jobs, nodes, and if you're on one of our recent releases, you can also limit key storage within the context of a project as well. You've always been able to provide access to a key store that someone could use in a project, but only recently could you limit that key to a specific project. That's the reason I make this distinction. And that's as of 3.4 or later. So access control policies look at things in essentially two ways. First, the project context. That's everything that you might want to access inside a project or do inside a project. The second is the system or Rundeck context. And you'll see when we get to the actual writing of some rules and some examples that context is one of the elements you need to address within your access control policies. Hopefully that helps get the big picture. Before we dig in too much further, I did want to talk about where you store your ACL policies. And I'm going to show you in the GUI that there's a couple places you can store policies, and that changes what you can do and who has access. But I will point out that there really is a third option that isn't really visible here. You can have policies stored as files on the file system. That's the default method for your first policy, but I would suggest that you, as you build your own policies, that you build them in the UI, in the web interface itself, and store them in one of the two locations I'll point you to here. The main distinction to remember is if a policy is defined on the file system, then if you're going to update it, you're also going to update it on the file system. If you need to replicate it anywhere, it's going to need to be copied to that other file system, whatever you need to do. If you instead put in your policy files essentially in through the web interface, you're not going to store them on the file system. Instead, you're going to store them in the database. By storing them in the database, if you're in enterprise, that means all your cluster members have access to that same data. And even if you're in the community version, that way, if you do a backup of your database or do anything else along that lines, you're keeping your ACL policies as part of the system rather than having them be on the file system. But either way will work. It's just different methods of editing and monitoring them. So within the system, as I said, there are two ways. The way you're probably used to if you've worked with ACL policies before is the admin gear up at the top. If you're storing ACL policies there, if you're clicking on the gear at the top and then clicking ACL and editing things there, those are being stored at a system level, which means for someone to access them to be able to make changes, they have to effectively have some level of admin access. Doesn't mean they have to be the admin, but they have to have a pretty high level of access to be able to edit those. And things that you put there can have both system and project context rules. So in one sense, you might look at that and say, well, this seems like it's a pretty good place for me to store it. It is, other than maybe you have to give away more permissions than you want to let somebody do the work there. The secondary place is the one that I think people overlook a lot, and that is when I'm in a project, I can store project level ACL policies for that project. I can only in that way have things that are specific to the project. But by doing that, I can delegate the creation or editing of policies to somebody who is an admin only for the project, and I don't need to give them the top level access in order for them to manipulate who can do what within the project. One aspect to bear in mind is you can't really give someone access to a project without having at least a few system level rules. So you will have to have some system level rules that could be kind of generic that cover everybody for all projects to give them enough access that they could do things in those other projects. But for them to do anything other than see that a project exists, they'll likely need rules, or they will need rules inside the project, and those could be stored in either place. I'm going to encourage you, and I'll come back to a few best practices to address, but I would encourage you where you can to store your ACLs in the project. It's a bit more secure because you're isolating the different pieces from one another, and it allows delegation, but it's also going to be more efficient. It means those rules will only ever get evaluated in the context of that project. And since they only apply to that project, that's kind of the right place to do it. But either way will work. I think at this point, I don't know that it will make a difference in terms of performance, but historically, if you're on older versions, if all of your policies are stored at the global level, even though they're project specific, there will be times where it's evaluating all rules every time you click somewhere in the interface. And that could make performance degradation a bigger issue. So if you're up to date, not a problem. But if you're on older versions, it's something to keep in mind that moving your project level rules into project storage is probably advisable to improve performance. I'm guessing this is going to lead to some questions, so keep your question in mind, or you can add them to the Q&A now so we can talk about them when we get there. All right, a few basics. So Rundeck uses access to control access to both resources and actions, where resources are the types of things we've been talking about: a project, a job, a node, a key. Actions are things like, can I run a job? Can I edit a job? Can I see history for a job? Can I create a project? Can I access nodes? There's lots of different things. There's whole pages of these permissions. So at a kind of high level, think of ACLs as the guardrails or the element that supports the guardrails that you have around your jobs. This is what really makes sure that Joe, the user, can only run jobs that he's supposed to and only has access to the nodes he needs for those jobs. He's not able to edit jobs. He's not able to change the system settings or access nodes outside of the jobs that he has access to. While Eileen, as more of an administrator, is able to access everything within their project. So there's a lot of control you can give out or hold back based on how you use this. I know in a lot of cases, people set access control up in a very permissive way because that's the simplest way to approach it, and that's okay. But as you look at what you're doing and as your use of Rundeck matures, it's worth considering whether you could have a less permissive access control set. That's where a lot of the value comes from. And beyond what I go over today, if you have questions, reach out to us and talk about what it is you want to accomplish. We can likely point you in the right direction in terms of what you might need to add or take away to accomplish what you want. And sometimes we can just pull together a specific example that you can work off of. In terms of the rules that we have in access policies, I can allow or deny. Most of the time, we're just allowing because deny is implied. If I haven't given you allow access, presumably I can't do it. But sometimes you need to deny a specific user who's a member of a larger group that is allowed to do something. So deny rules, if they exist, will always override an allow rule. So bear in mind, you have that capability if you need to. One thing to think about from a security perspective is we can give users the ability to run ad hoc commands, but that's giving them a lot of access to your nodes. They can do virtually anything on the machines that you've given them access to. So if they have access to all nodes in a project and they have access to commands as well, you're not really limiting what they can do. So you may consider at least disabling the ad hoc command feature, even if they need access to those nodes to run the jobs. You may want to consider kind of limiting that aspect to make things a bit better locked down. As I said earlier, we're going to take advantage of the usernames and jobs you already have. So no need to think too hard about that. This is something that kind of comes as part of the package when you set up your authentication. If you're doing local users, that might be stored in a file on the system instead of in your enterprise system. But either way, we're taking advantage of the users and groups that are defined for you. All right, so I'm gonna walk us through an example. As I said, most of you probably have a relatively permissive policy, which might essentially give people access to one or two projects or maybe all projects, but chances are they might be able to do everything within a project. And that's okay, depending on the nature of the team and what they need to do. But that means you're giving people access to run commands, as I said. You're giving them access to edit jobs, which means they can create jobs to do anything they want to the machines that you're giving them access to as part of nodes. So the example I'm going to look at here is an example where we're trying to limit them to be able to just run jobs rather than edit jobs. So in that way, they're not going to have command access, and therefore they're only going to be able to do the things that someone has created a job to do against the nodes that they have permission for. So this is an example, and we'll share the slide deck with you afterwards, and you really could take this example as is if you wanted to. If you just change out the project name and the group name, this is a working policy. I tested it in my own environment to make sure it does exactly what it is intended. And I added comments for essentially every piece of it to give you some explanation as to why these pieces are there. So this is definitely less access than you get in your admin policy. But in my mind, this is the minimum access you'd need to give to somebody who needs to run jobs. So as I mentioned earlier, the top level section is the system context. These are the rules that are set outside of the project that give access to be able to see that the project exists, and in this case, to allow access to keys that you need to access the nodes. So that's that. Again, the bottom section says by group, and the group name is group 123. Obviously, you'd have that be whatever group name you need it to be, but that's defining who has it. So as long as someone who logs in is a member of group 123, then these sets of policy rules will apply to them. The bottom section is most of what you need. It is in the context of a particular project. In this case, I'm referring to a project called PagerDuty. If you wanted it to be for all projects, so you wanted them to have access as a runner for all projects, you could change that instead to be .star effectively for the project name, and that would provide permission for all of them, which is the same way that I did the project match above. So the top level section is effectively giving them the minimum access to be able to see the list of project names, unless they have further rules in the bottom section for that project or all projects. They won't actually be able to drill in and do anything in the projects. So the project context rules essentially say, give them access to nodes, let them see job history, allow them to see and run and kill jobs, and give them a little additional node access to be able to do the job run itself. So you'll notice in this case, there are two different references to nodes. The top one lets them see the nodes list under the kind of left-hand context menu. So see the nodes that belong to the project. The bottom one is the one that lets them access the nodes for running jobs. So in this way, if I want to run jobs, I need both of those in addition to the option by job. And again, we've got a by context for the group. Hopefully that makes sense. As I said, if you were to take this, this would give you a policy that you could apply to someone who you just want to be able to give access to run jobs. And we could get more specific than this, but I wanted to keep it simple for today's example. Let's see. So again, context, is this a system? Is this for the system, meaning it's a global rule, or is it for our projects? Then what are the resources that we're allowing or denying access to, and in what way are we going to be used? Is this read, is this run, etc.? And then lastly, which user or group is this rule associated with? So I've got kind of two different rules, each of which has a couple clauses in them to complete this overall policy. So I wanted to make a couple of recommendations. As I said earlier, if you particularly if you're on an older version of the product, store as many of your policies as possible at the project level. So if they are specific to a particular project, store them there instead of at the global level to ensure that they're only being evaluated when you need them to be. I'd recommend that you create and edit your policies in the Rundeck database, meaning in the web UI, rather than putting them on the file system. It'll make them more visible to your admins. It makes them easier for you to update and compare. But that's, that's as you choose. I'm not saying that you absolutely have to. And if you are on 3.4 or later, consider doing your key access in the project context rather than the global context in order to be more secure. So this is intended to address a scenario where you might have given somebody access to a key so that they could run jobs in project A, but they're a job editor in project B. In the old way of handling keys, that would allow them to use those keys from project A in project B and let them potentially do more than you intended. So if you can limit your keys and passwords to the project context, then you'll avoid that sort of scenario. It's definitely an edge case, but I think worth keeping in mind if you're particularly security conscious. All right, that's it for the main stuff. So let me take us over to some Q&A. There were a few questions that came in early. I want to address those, and that'll give those of you in the audience today a chance to ask questions as well before we wrap up. So the first question, can access to key storage be controlled on a per project basis? I'm guessing the answer to this one is now clear, but it's a valid question. Historically, you couldn't. Now it really is controlled in 3.4 or later. What's the easiest way to provide admin level access to all projects for a specific group? That's a good question. There is, when you first install Rundeck, on the file system on your Rundeck server, there is a file called admin.acl policy, if I'm remembering rightly. And frankly, the easiest way to create a comparable access for someone other than admin is to copy what's in that file and just change the group name from admin to whatever name you need it to be. That's going to give them essentially the same access as admin. Now, that may be more permissive than you intend, but if you're looking for the fastest, easiest way to get that working, that's the way I'd approach it. That's what I've suggested to customers in the past. We can talk, as I said, about more detailed ways to lock things down, but that'll get you the basics right away. I have users who can run jobs but not see job history. What gives? All right, that's a fair question. I did kind of allude to this as I went through, and I copied over what we had. So this was the policy we looked at. I've highlighted the piece that's necessary. So if you tried to create your own policy, which it sounds like someone did, and you didn't have enough for them to get job history, just make sure that you're allowing events with a read permission under that project context, and that will let them see the job history. Without this, they can run the job, but they can't see the activity history, which is what was being referenced. All right, a couple of docs pages I want to point to. The two main ones that I go back to when I'm trying to figure something out related to ACLs. The first one is the overview of the ACL policy process. It kind of talks about what the different elements are of ACL and all of that sort of stuff, but it's high level. It definitely doesn't cover everything, but it does have some examples in it. The second one that I refer to when I'm trying to remember a specific policy clause is the second page. It has all the different options that you can use inside an ACL policy. So if it is possible to do, it's documented on that page, and all of the different options that you have. So, you know, if you need the thorough details, then I would check that second page. But I always start with the first page because that's got the basics on it and reminds me of what I need to know. I did want to remind everybody of a couple of Rundeck resources. If you are interested in finding out more about open source just generally, you can go to our open source page. If you want to talk with other users about Rundeck, there's a community page on PagerDuty where you can post your questions or talk with other users. And if you want to find out about releases and get the release notes, there's a place that you can go to sign up for that as well. I'm going to stop and answer questions if there are any, and let me go and see what we've got. Tracy, have we had questions come in? I'm guessing you've kept an eye on things.
Yeah, Nathan, we do. Harry had one come in. The question is, do you still need to assign ACL from the global level when you're going to manage from the project level? Meaning, can you only do from the project level and not global? Or do you still need combination of global plus project ACL to manage the ACL?
In order for someone to manage the ACLs at the project level, they have to have been in, they do have to have something at the global level. That's a good question, Harry. Let me think about that a little bit. I mean, as I said earlier, for you to do anything in the project, there will be an element that is in the global context. But that's not quite what you're asking. I don't think you have to have anything special at the global level in order to be a policy editor at the project level beyond what I'd included in my example. The permissions you need to have to manage ACL policies are something that you're given at the project level anyway. So I think you can do what you want without having to do anything extra at the global level. I'll process that through my head a little bit as we're answering other questions as well.
Great, thank you. Next question that came in I downloaded the Rundeck Community Edition for Windows, and I got a .war file. There are really no useful instructions to install on my Windows laptop. Where can I get the installation instructions for the Community Edition?
Sure. Let me stop sharing the deck and bring up a browser instead, and I can show you where that is. In general, if you need instructions related to Rundeck, I always go to docs.rundeck.com, docs.rundeck.com. The couple of links that I mentioned earlier are a subset of that. That includes installation instructions and other types of documentation. But let me take us to the page that's relevant there. So give me a moment.
As a follow-up question to that, Nathan, they asked, and where can I find the Community Edition Quick Start Guide with examples on how to set up and execute remote jobs?
I'm not sure I have an easy answer on that one, Rao. So let me start here. If you come to the guide and go to installing and then go to Windows here, this information is going to be relevant whether you're doing community or enterprise. The actual installation steps are the same. Essentially, you're going to do a WAR file. So the element you need to consider ahead of time is you need to have Java. So you need to make sure that you've installed the JDK on your Windows system or whatever platform you're going to do if you're going to go to the WAR install. And then if you follow these instructions, you'd be good to go.
Can you share your screen, Nathan? I don't.
Oh, sorry. That really didn't help then, did it? Yeah. Sorry, it's that kind of day. All right, so I came into the administration guide here and went to the installation section and then clicked on Windows here. These are the instructions that you need. As I said, these instructions are relevant for Windows, whether you're talking about the community version or the enterprise version. I'm going to suggest if you've got a question on the installation piece, the first place to check if you are installing community or working with the community version is one of those community links that I just covered. You can ask other community users. But you're welcome to drop me an email. I'm happy to help point you in the right direction if you have further questions. I'm just Nathan@rundeck.com is the easy email, and I'm happy to include some links there or answer some questions there. Did we have any other questions come up, Tracy? I'm not sure I can say too much more to that without digging into the specifics of their case.
Don't have any other open questions at this time, so don't be shy. Drop those questions into the Q&A while we have Nathan live with us today.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time and appreciate the questions. Looking forward to talking to you guys again sometime soon.